When a super cyclone hits, we typically end up doing, again, I feel that is that we look at financial losses, we look at loss of assets. What people are not paying that much attention is the loss of other assets that these households have. The principal asset those households have is the community relations, the social relations that they hold with one another to be able to sustain. And when you have events like a super cyclone or an floods or droughts as such, rapid migration and stuff like that, that social network is totally disrupted. And in a way you get them more vulnerable to so many other challenges that it's quite unthinkable as such. So my point here is basically saying that yes, you have to attend to those, but can we be much more meaningful, much more intentional about figuring out ways by which we can build the resilience of communities by themselves, to actually say that, okay, this has been happening for the last 3 years, it's quite possible that it will happen this year as well. How do we prepare better?
Over the past decade, climate change has shifted from a peripheral concern to a global emergency. But have our responses kept pace with its escalating urgency? Are we addressing symptoms instead of root causes? To unpack these questions, I'm honored to welcome Moutushi Sengupta, a visionary leader with over 2 decades of experience in the development sector. Ma'am has spearheaded groundbreaking initiatives at organizations like the MacArthur Foundation, AVPN, DFID, where she championed climate resilience, gender inclusion, and equitable philanthropy. She's also the co founder of One World Collab, a bold new venture focused on unlocking collaborative solutions for climate action and social equity. In this episode, we trace climate action's evolution, examine overlooked forces like climate driven migration, collapsing community networks, and losses that defy financial matrix. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Anirudh. Thank you for the opportunity. Really looking forward to our conversation.
Ma'am, can we begin this conversation by first tapping into your experience of 25 years working in the development sector and trying and understand from your perspective that how have you seen climate action in particular, its response and understanding evolve over this period?
Thank you, Anirudh. I think really a very important question. It is, so the attention to environment, attention to climate is not totally new. Even when I started, my first engagement was to work with a forestry project that was being supported by the Department for International Development, which was part of government of UK, in terms of promoting joint forestry management in the state of Karnataka as such. And there was a lot of attention to sort of building watersheds which would actually conserve water, which is still a very, very critical resource in management. Basically we were trying all sorts of techniques and processes, trying to bring the community to play a more active role in the management of these natural resources. Then, there was this phase when the focus shifted to Watershed Plus, to say that we really need to be careful about what the level of dependence, livelihood dependence that there was currently on watersheds, to look at how else can, village communities come together to manage the environment. And then there was a whole thing about looking at rural livelihoods, looking at moving even beyond, to say that, how can you look at non-farm livelihoods patterns as well? Because by then, in the last 10 years, by 10 years, I think about last 15 years, there's been a fair amount of understanding to say that the farms and the set of natural resources around it could not sustain the level of population and households that currently were dependent on them. So all I'm trying to get at is that this concept is not new. Now what has happened is, I think over the last few years, climate, which sort of embraces all this and much more, has started taking a much more predominant role in terms of development philanthropy, For several reasons. I mean, I think what we are witnessing today is a rapid rise in temperature, which was quite unprecedented. And that has had tremendous impact on the way lives have been affected. And as we all know, that when phenomena like this happens, the households and communities which are really at the bottom of the pyramid get far more affected than the ones higher up. But it is actually affecting everybody now. Then the other thing which we are all witnessing is just the increasing incidence of extreme weather events, hurricanes, typhoons, floods, droughts, snow in places where it never was thought of. So very unusual incidences, but the frequency is going up, and as a result, again, there is a lot of displacement and dislocation. Interestingly, with all this, what is happening is that how does it impact? Of course, it is impacting households as such. We are also seeing impacts on migration patterns. So because there is no crop at the end of the season because of a sudden hailstorm or lengthy droughts as such, several more families are now sort of being forced into migration. Again, migration by itself is not it's not a phenomena which one would say is wrong by itself, but people should have the choice of doing it, taking it up by by their own intention, not be forced into it. So we are seeing climate sort of play out a role in so many dimensions that there is no other way but to sort of raise the bar, push through, ramp up activities on climate change. So over the last 10 years, I think several philanthropies have come together to say that we need to figure out solutions. And when we talk about climate, we also talk about what about it, because since it's a global phenomena, and doing something in, let's say, point X doesn't necessarily lead to changes in point X, because as students of geography, we said, what was climate? Climate was temperature, pressure, and rainfall patterns, right? And soil conditions. Now, you cannot have very, very narrowly defined interventions which can really bring about impactful change. Now, when we talk about climate now, we have to look at the larger picture. We have to figure out a way by which, the contributors are actually sort of taken into consideration in developing solutions. And I can't say that we have got all the solutions as of now. We still have much to discover. But yes, it is one of the largest phenomena that you and I are witnessing in this lifetime.
I mean, how would you evaluate its response and understanding within the government and within the NGO sector when it comes to, as we all know, that it's taking center stage with respect to every problem? But do you think that the response and the understanding is adequate?
No, it is not. It is not adequate as of now, but I feel that all these actors, so the social development ecosystem is quite more mature now than 25 years back when I started. You had few NGOs doing good work with communities as such. You had the government, which of course was a very important actor, and you really didn't have intermediaries, and of course you had the philanthropic funders. But now if you compare that ecosystem to what we have now, it's far more nuanced. You have several other layers of actors and processes and schemes which have come into play, and which is good, because that sort of indicates that there is far better awareness on social challenges. However, I think given the scale of the challenge that climate change is posing, I think we need to do far more than what we are currently doing. So even while the SDGs talk about climate action, SDG 13, you will see climate sort of featuring across almost 7 or 8 SDGs actually in some form or the other, whether it's life in oceans, whether it's talking about livelihoods, whether it's talking about gender inequality. And I'm happy to talk through those if you would like me to. But in a way, the climate challenge, I think, is one of those super large phenomena which is sort of impacting several other areas of growth. And if we don't take that, what is the opportunity cost? If we don't act up to the level that is desired as such, I think we stand to lose several gains which have been made over the last several decades. Very hard-earned gains that have been made by the social sector, whether it's the government, whether it's whether it's the non-profit sector, whether it's intermediaries, we would be losing those, and again reworking what we need to do. And that is a super waste of resources. It will impact lives, and so I feel this is the time. This is the time to act. I mean, just as the challenge is huge, it is also an opportunity for you and me to act on it, right? How many generations can actually stand up to say, "Oh, we had the opportunity to deal with challenges of this scale, and you know, have had done something about it." So, but I think there is a lot happening, but much more needs to be done.
Ma'am, an interesting aspect of our pre-recording call, wherein you mentioned that we need to bring back attention to what is truly required to solve the climate crisis. And the interesting aspect was bringing back attention to what is truly required. So there is a statement that we are doing to solve the climate crisis, but there's also a conclusion that our efforts might not be directed in the right direction. Can you unpack that a little bit, and maybe we can dive deep down as to where should we direct our attention, one, and second, how should we focus better with respect to structuring our approach towards climate action?
Correct. No, those are very good questions, Anirudh. So, again, I feel that funding for challenges like this is there, but still quite low compared to the scale of the challenge. If we had to really prioritize, then we have to figure out where that money is best spent. And I've always held that philanthropy is actually the rarest form of gold that you have in hand as such. So to use philanthropic funding for experiments, for policies, for activities which really can be supported by other forms of capital, I feel is a wastage. I think given the availability of philanthropic capital by itself is so low compared to what is possible. I think it is really important to really drill down to figure out how do you define the challenge, and how do you actually, which part of this large phenomena of climate change do you really want to work on? Because again, as we discussed earlier, I think climate change is sort of manifesting itself in several ways, right? But those are the ways it is manifesting. So while you have to, you and I have to really look at dimensions of manifestations, we are largely then dealing with symptoms or things which are there rather than the causes. So when you come to a situation where, let's say, there's been a super cyclone, and you are rushing aid, rushing all your resources to fight that, it is important because you have families, households who have lost everything, right? Could we do something in advance to build resilience of communities to save themselves from that level of disaster? I mean, when a super cyclone hits, I'm sure there's going to be a fairly large impact as such. But can we reduce the intensity of loss? Can we, and what we typically end up doing, again, I feel that is that we look at financial losses. We look at loss of assets. What people are not paying that much attention is the loss of other assets that these households have. So as you go down the lower rungs of, lower is a wrong term, but as you start focusing at the bottom of the pyramid, the principal asset those households have is the community relations, the social relations that they hold with one another to be able to sustain. And when you have events like a super cyclone or floods or droughts as such, rapid migration and stuff like that, that social network is totally disrupted. And in a way, you get them more vulnerable to so many other challenges that, it's quite unthinkable as such. So my point here is basically saying that, yes, you have to attend to those, but can we be much more meaningful, much more intentional about figuring out ways by which we can build the resilience of communities by themselves, to actually say that, okay, this has been happening for the last 3 years, it's quite possible that it will happen this year as well. How do we prepare better? How do we actually create, and there are examples, there are good examples, some good examples coming up as such, but being very, very stingy with the money that you have so that it is directed towards the right set of issues and not really keep trying things which are like, putting a band-aid over the problem and sort of taking the family to the next or the household to the next year again.
Before I ask my next question, I'm very curious about the way you put it about diagnosing the problem, not the causes. And I think that's very right, because what happens, it's more like a disease. If you're suffering from something and you only keep treating the symptoms, that disease will reoccur.
Correct.
But ma'am, according to you, like the work that you have done, have you been able to identify, or the work that you've been doing with partners, identifying such areas which could be the real causes where we need to direct more attention? Do you want to talk a little bit about that areas or places where you found to be most problematic and which also hold a lot of promise in driving climate action?
Good. So sometimes you see, in some ways, yes, I have been lucky to come across some of these examples as such. I feel that you have several very strong-minded human beings and organizations working on these causes at this point in time. So the intent is there. What is sometimes missing is sort of figuring out, first of all, defining the problem in its proper space and time, because these are not even three-dimensional challenges in most cases. They are multi-dimensional. And it's actually beyond the capacity of any one organization to actually solve it by themselves. However, I feel that both funders as well as non-profits need to figure out what is it that they are trying to solve as such in that larger problem. So defining the problem in its own way, I think the development challenges are actually very complex, in the sense that, you think that you have solved one line of work, and then again the next layer of challenges come through as such. And so there very rarely, very, very rarely you'll come across a situation where a solution is absolutely 100% in line with what is there. It could be a medicine, yes, that you are able to define a quinine for a malaria, that solves the problem, but in real world it's very difficult to come by. So when you are talking about challenges, how do you figure out what is your starting point? What is the goal that you are trying to achieve? What would success look like? If let's say 10 years down the line, you found yourself standing in a crossroad as a leader of an organization, looking back, what would success look like to you? And that needs to be defined now. So one of the things that, when I was in Makatha, which we did a study to say, how do you reach scale on the solutions? Now, the issue is, say, not about, reaching at point X and saying, oh, I'll go to 100X from here. You have to start with the idea of reaching scale right from the beginning. Your solution pattern is going to be very different than what you would do if it was a smaller number that you are talking about. So scale starts from the beginning, and you have to be constantly attentive to say that, okay, fine, am I on the right track or not? So whether the non-profit wants to get into scale or not, it's its own decision, and not every problem can reach the point of scale, honestly, and should not be tried to push into that space either. But it's very, very important for every organization to sort of take a pause and say that, okay, fine, where is it that I'm headed? Where do I see myself in 5 years' time? And it's important to do that because the nature of the problem itself will also have changed. It won't be the same problem that they are dealing with today as in 5 years' time. We talk about Gen Z and Gen Alpha, Gen Beta. Every generation has its own challenge and opportunities, and similar is the case with the environment that you and I inhabit, So the issues become very different. And if I wanted to stay meaningful, if I wanted to stay relevant, if I wanted to be authentic, I think it's really very important to keep your eye on the ball all the time. And to do that, I think non-profits also require the support of funders. And so I would not say in any way that they are the only ones who should be taking this, this run alone. But funders also need to actually sort of look at it from that perspective and not say, oh, fine, you said this will happen, why has this not happened? So sometimes you need to have numbers, and sometimes some of the change that you are looking for can be translated into quantitative targets. But not everything can be, done in that manner. And there is enough evidence to say that because you were trying to attain quantitative figures, you end up not looking into other qualitative issues which are equally important. So how do you define the challenge in its own way? How do you define your own pathway? And to have the humility and the acknowledgement to bring the right type of organizations and partners together to say, okay, can we jointly do this? Because these challenges are huge. Yeah.
Your answer also made me reflect on I can draw an exact parallel to my professional journey as well, because I'm thinking, what are my challenges? So I think there is an overlap when we think about these problems that we face today, like the problems that we have as individuals or as organizations. The idea, as you said, that to have your eye on the ball,
Yeah.
to define your goals, to what do you really want. So
Yeah.
I think those abstract principles that are absolutely necessary, I think, which we say going back to the drawing board, is something which is way more important than just pumping in money and knowing what you want to do. So that's a very profound realization that there are parallels both ways.
Absolutely. And the funniest thing, Anirudh, I have realized, and this is something one of my mentors mentioned, saying that, we keep talking about, oh, we have to solve the problem. We have to solve the problem as such. On the other hand, what is required is that, yes, you have to solve the problem, but you also need to give yourself the free time to say, what is the problem that I'm solving now for? And sort of going back to even to doodles or whatever. So in a way, that's giving yourself space, acknowledging, giving yourself, and when I say yourself, I'm talking about organizations as well, to say that, to give that space to say, okay, I don't necessarily have to do exactly what I'm told. I am the expert here. My funders don't necessarily need to know all the answers to a situation. Like if I am the expert and if I were asked, what would a solution look like? Would the solution that I'm doing now be fully aligned with what is required? And it's not hard work. It's just that, and it's human tendency to keep looking at what you have in your own bag rather than saying, okay, fine, the bag sits somewhere, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't, it is not standing in isolation or sitting in isolation. Yeah.
Ma'am, another interesting aspect that you mentioned was capturing value, which is beyond finances. And from your other talks as well, I see that you're a big proponent of capturing not only financial value, but other value as well into the ecosystem, that what other things bring. Ma'am, would you want to put a highlight on one of the works that is happening or one of the other promising areas which is evolving, which is trying to capture this value that you're talking about? Because I think we talk a lot about going beyond GDP, right? But at the end of the day, we all are looking at those same numbers. So is there some interesting work happening on that end which you have come across or have seen, which you might want to highlight?
Anirudh, I really, really wish I had a very clear answer to this, and I don't. Because, much of the decay and much of the disproportionate misuse of natural resources we look around today is because we can't assign a very clear value to it as yet. And what is available is very complicated, and it is as so complicated for the common person to actually engage with, then he said, okay, fine, don't need to bother about it. But I really, really wish, if we were able to figure out, I know it's very important, and examples or interventions which take into consideration the engagement of the community for which the solution is being drawn, where and the agency, when the community actually is trying to sort of take full ownership of that, of proper implementation of the solution, the chances of that solution actually creating an impact is much higher. The microfinance movement, where women came together to say, no, we will take responsibility, we will take the largely to make sure that everybody paid on time. Similarly, for others also, when the community comes together and whoever your target, those are the ones that the chances of success are far higher. Things can still be different. Like, you can still end up creating a school in a very remote area, and the next year the drought is so high that families just migrate out, and so the school is not utilized. However, chances of the probability of success in a scenario like this, where the community has come together to find a solution, is much higher. The sustainability potential is much higher. And so we have some intermediate steps which are very clearly laid out. And most of the time, because we are looking at financial success, we end up putting that aside. Or just in trying to answer positively to a funder, we say, okay, let's push everything aside, make sure that, we have achieved whatever we have set out to achieve. So again, there's no point blaming only one organization in this, because it is the ecosystem which has become far more oriented towards getting quantitative results. It is the ecosystem which is like looking at very short-term gains. It is the ecosystem which has become far more risk-averse than when I started out, as such. And it's the ecosystem which is not trying to do much about creatively figuring out new ways of working together, because the world itself has changed considerably. Some things remain where they are, some things have become worse, and there are many things which have become very different. So I think we are still scratching the surface when it comes to looking at finding solutions using the new tools we have available, whether it's technology, whether it's looking at ways of better data management, analytics, more education, which wasn't there, those levels of education at that time. Are we really leveraging these gains properly to be able to achieve human development success? And I don't think we are anywhere near there as yet. Yeah.
Ma'am, having highlighted these challenges so eloquently, would you want to share some of the tips that you follow, seeing all the challenges that you just highlighted while you are engaged in grant making? What is your theory of change? Because as you very well recognize the positives and negatives, and you also are able to see that we might have our own biases when it comes to identifying funders to whom you might want to direct funds. But what is your process, and what aspect do you think can benefit the most?
Yeah. So to me, I think there are 3 or 4 things I really look forward to when I'm actually looking at a proposal as such. Number one, whether the narrative is tightly defined. So for me to get a sense whether this organization really understands what it is trying to achieve, and what is the level of research it has done in terms of trying to understand whether the direction of travel is right or not. So for instance, once we had an example, I had an example of a very well-known think tank coming to me to say, oh, we want to actually establish a green bank. I'm talking about 2015, when the idea of a green bank was fairly new as such. And then when you went into details, what I realized was that they hadn't really thought through the type of approvals and planning that they would need to do if they wanted to have a green bank in place. So for me, it was like a showstopper there to say, oh, the topic by itself doesn't hold much merit unless the organization which takes on the responsibility of executing it understands and can see where the beginning is and where the end is. So that's a very important piece for me, whether the narrative is clearly defined or not. Second is, how would whether this organization is open enough to question itself to say whether it works. What would they do if they found out, that this particular type of work is not actually yielding results, and intermediate steps like that. So that is the second piece, that whether they have built in proper process issues, process indicators to reach there. So the final indicator by itself is important, but not the only thing that I would look for. I'm very clear, would look at what is it that the organization plans to do in the intermediate period to figure out if they're on the right track or not. So not necessarily looking for only stories of success. right? The third piece I feel, which is also very important, is the level of hunger in that organization to bring that change on the ground as such. And so those are the three that I would say are the really big ones for me. As such, beyond that, of course, whether the team is strong enough, whether whether the team feels equipped enough to speak, and not just the leader. There are a lot of organizations who come and they're like, okay, only the leader speaks and the rest of them are all quiet. So that's not a good sign, honestly, for me. So the journey and the story needs to be held by more people than one, as such. Yeah. So those are the things that I would look for.
And ma'am, if we were to put together this entire conversation and summarize it with your call to action, now that we have recognized certain problems, areas of promise, how do you view the problem? What would be your guiding principles to someone who's listening to this conversation, maybe a youngster, maybe a professional, maybe a policymaker? How would you summarize, how do you envision this journey forward for the maximum impact?
I would say two things. The first is that I think there's a role for everybody. Yeah. So it doesn't matter which station of life you currently occupy or are sort of driving towards. Everybody has a role, and I think it's an important piece to build in, to say that yes, what is it that I can do to reach there as such? How can I contribute? And development challenges are such that you have different ways of contributing as well. So I think it is very important. The second thing I would say is that keep a balance between the head and the heart. Don't totally get pulled into the head piece, because sometimes the mind can actually tell you lies. But if you actually are trying to solve a problem with your head and heart together, I think the chances of finding the right solution are much higher. And in doing so, actually I have taken the plunge myself. Now I have set up my own organization, Anirudh. I'm planning to work with people who are value aligned on this to find authentic solutions, to see on climate, on gender, on looking at ways by which you can unlock more capital for the non-profit sector as such going forward. But
would you want to talk a little bit more about it, or share what are you looking at or your recent plans?
Okay. So after several years of working in different organizations, and this has come after a lot of thinking as such, to say that how do I continue to do the work? Because this work gives me a sense of purpose, honestly. So I really think that, as long as it is fun, as long as it gives you purpose, it's totally worth moving forward with it. So last year, in fact, I co-founded an organization called One World Collab, which is now looking in two places, I'm sure, and I'm still in the process of fleshing out ideas myself, looking at ways by which we can amplify climate action and making it, achieving it through inclusive processes, so that, we have more women participating in that way, marginalized communities participating in building the solutions in some ways. Working through new ways of delivery as well. So working with networks, collaboratives rather than individual organizations. And also looking at ways by which one can support the current set of actors to achieve what they are doing. So that is the general idea at this point in time. I'm very excited since this has started beginning of this year. So I'm hoping that I can bring together the experience I've had with the AVPN, which is the global network of social investors and some very dedicated investors, Makatha Foundation, Co-Impact, Oxfam, DFID. So I'm very excited at this point in time trying to figure out what the future can hold. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I have followed your journey for quite some time now, and seeing the kind of impact you've had, I can only wish and pray that you succeed in what you've done already and you continue this streak. And for this conversation, I think it's so important to realize, I think the biggest takeaway for me at least is to first stop and also, realize, like as you said, the sense of purpose. And I think that adds meaning. I think that's something which all of us, the work that we do and our individual lives can look for to have more impact. And the kind of solutions you've shared, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you,
And
Anirudh. Thank you for taking the
it was a great
opportunity
chatting with you, ma'am.
available. Lovely.